Hey everybody, and welcome to another online lesson. Today we are going to look at the Munich Putsch in November 8th and 9th of 1923. This is the first attempt of Hitler to take control of Germany. I think he thinks the time is right. 1923 has been a really, really bad year. Hyperinflation and the invasion of the Ruhr. This topic is also really brilliant for Section B. It lends itself perfectly to two interpretations. One side of the argument that the Munich Putsch was successful, and the other that it was a complete and total disaster. So as we go through this lesson and you're making your notes, just think about in the back of your mind evidence and examples of good or bad or success or failure. All right, this is one of the best stories in the Germany course and really does start sowing the seeds of what's going to come later on in the course. So our aim really for this is to understand firstly the causes of the Munich Putsch and then the consequences. And it's those consequences where we start thinking about success in long or short-term success. All right, so let's get straight on with it, and we'll begin thinking about the causes of the Munich Putsch. But before we do that, and the notes that I think would be useful to make for this story, because it's quite a big story with lots of connecting parts, but it also feeds forward. As you can see on the screen, it's a couple of boxes. I just think it would be a good idea to organise your notes based on these little subtitles. So a little summary of the story, maybe you could do that at the end. The key people as we go through this lesson, write a little bit about them. So Karl, Ludendorff, Hitler, we'll talk about them as we go. The first real task of this lesson is short and long-term causes. And then, of course, the events of the 8th and the 9th you'll see from the story that we talk about, and so on. So try and fill out your notes like this. Otherwise, do them however you feel works best for you, as long as they're organised and you can sort of step back and see the big picture, as well as zoom in and find some really short-term causes or events, consequences, and long-term. All right, so firstly then, the task, pause the video and just do a little short-term, long-term, medium-term diagram, however you want to do it. In a second, I'm going to put lots of events on there. But before we do, try and think of all the events so far in the Germany story and just put them in your list, however you're doing this, before we look at some of the things you can say. And just to get a little bit of revision, really, to think about the course so far. It's always really useful, I think, to consolidate as we're going. It sort of takes a bit of pressure off at the end of year 11, doesn't it? So think of everything that's happened so far in the Germany course. And put them in short, long term, medium term. I think probably short term should be anything that really is 1923. Medium term, I would say maybe 1922, maybe 21 at a push. And then long term, anything before 1921, or 1919, 1918, back to this end of the war. When you're ready, unpause and move on, and then I'll see a couple of categories. I'll put some on for you. If you then categorize them into short, medium, and long term, and then we'll have a little look at where they should have been and how correct you were. Okay, so these are the events that you might want to add if you haven't got these already. I don't suppose you would know too much about Mussolini if you just did that task first. But now, 1922, you should be thinking, well, that's sort of medium term. We'll talk about Mussolini as we go through this lesson. But these events here, hopefully you've got the Treaty of Versailles. That was quite an obvious one. Anything related to the Treaty of Versailles, I suppose. Dolchstoss. And of course, by now, the size of the NSDAP. Just add these things where you think they should fit in medium, long, or short term. Hopefully, these are extra to some of the things you just came up with, but certainly, hopefully, you came up with some of these as well. All right, when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll have a little look at how these things fit. Right, welcome back. So, this is where I'd put those events we've just seen on the screen. 1923 short term. This is the year of the putsch, so the triggers, if you like. But we go right back to the beginning, the invasion of the Ruhr. That was for the missed payments, which then led to the strikes, which then led to the hyperinflation, and just really added to the anger and hatred towards the Weimar Republic already, particularly in Ebert's failure to deal with it. And source A gives us a really good little insight into what people believed at the time, the causes of it. This is from the Bavarian police themselves. As a result of rising prices and unemployment, the workers are bitter. The patriotic are at fever pitch. That means they're at a frenzy, they're angry because of the failure of the resistance in the Ruhr. So this thing in the Ruhr has been going on now. If this source is in September and the invasion of the Ruhr was in January, then the strikes obviously have been going on quite a long time now and nothing seems to be getting better or working out. This is possibly why this Munich Putsch has happened. The people, especially the most patriotic, so the right-wing nationalists in Bavaria, are particularly angry. Maybe that's what's triggered Hitler to do this in 1923. So medium term, if we look at Italy, we go to Rome, a guy called Mussolini. He was a fascist dictator as well. Essentially, though, he just marched on Rome and took over the country. And Hitler's looked at that and thought, well, if that's possible in Italy, then we can do it here in Germany as well. Don't forget, all of Europe is pretty much unstable following World War One. Recovery is slow. So this is really Hitler's maybe medium-term push that he's thinking maybe now's the time or soon is the time. And this interpretation gives us a bit of an idea of maybe you could agree with this or disagree with this. And if you're watching this in Year 11 revising at the end of the course, you know the big picture, you know what's coming. So maybe you could start thinking whether or not you agree with these interpretations. Always really good practice. It says the March on Rome galvanized, so motivated the fascist movements in Europe. It showed all basically the fascists in Europe, all the right-wing nationalists or extreme right-wing nationalists, that it was possible. As the situation in Germany began to deteriorate with all of the things we've looked at in the short term, 1923, Hitler began to think that he could do the same in Germany as Mussolini had done in Italy. So I can agree with that. I would be quite confident in agreeing with that. That is a fair and valid interpretation of why the Munich Putsch happened in 1923. There's lots of evidence to suggest that. It's just that feeling. You could probably look at that in the current world that we're in now. In 2025 in our world, there's a bit of a growth, isn't there? A rise of the extreme nationalism around Europe and around the world. I guess we go through periods of history where that generally happens and then things calm down a little bit. Maybe there's a war or something that settles everything down. History generally does tend to repeat itself. So maybe in that case, interpretation 1 from Richard J. Evans is definitely a valid interpretation. So then if we look at the longer term causes, hopefully this is obvious now that you see them, if you didn't manage to put them in your own little list at the start of this lesson. But we go right back to the November criminals, signing the armistice to end World War One. That angered the nationalists. They felt they were winning the war. The Kaiser was telling everyone it was going really well. Then it was just done on November the 11th. Dolchstoss, the feeling of being stabbed in the back, that hasn't ever really gone away. People are angry, they're poor, they're suffering. We know all of the things in the post-war period, eating animals at the zoo, the lack of food. All of those things are still there. This is only, remember, 5 years after World War One. The lost colonies affected their pride, remember, and the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations of 6.6 billion on top of the debt of 37 billion from the war. Altogether, you can see why this has led to this point. And also, I think, which is really important, and if I was going to give you an interpretation as a historian, I might say the fact that the NSDAP has now grown to 50,000 members, and we've got that huge force of the SA now as well by the end of 1923, that probably in itself gives Hitler the confidence to go for this growing party that's grown rapidly, and overall all of those things in the Treaty of Versailles is the crutch of all anger within Germany. So that really is the causes of the Munich Putsch. Fairly straightforward, I think. Hopefully you agree. You just got to try and see this as a story, how one thing added to the other made things worse, and it just keeps adding to it. And then in the end, you're left with no choice, really, if you're the Nazis and you're Hitler, but to sort of take back your country. And obviously those kind of things are what nationalist parties would promote. They would find the weaknesses in their governments and exploit them and attack them and try and get support that way. So a nice easy start to this topic really is the causes of the Munich Putsch. So if you have access to The Rise of Evil, you may have it on the Google Classroom, or if you've got the DVD yourself. A really good visual of the first bit of the story is from about 58 minutes to 1 hour and 6 minutes. Just go and watch that now if you can, in between the start of the lesson and as we carry on, just to visualize as we go. The Rise of Evil is incredible and really brilliant film or docu-film, whatever you're going to call it, that visualizes the story of our Rise of Hitler story. Okay, so when you're ready and you've watched that, if you can, let's carry on with today's lesson. So, the summary of the story. Remember, we've got some boxes that you're filling in if you're doing your notes that way. Otherwise, we could just quickly talk through the summary and you can put this where you think it needs to go. So, here we are in 1923. Hitler's the head of a small party called the Nazi Party, which is growing since he's taken over. Obviously, his speaking powers, his ability, all the things we've talked about in previous lessons. It hates the Treaty of Versailles, and it hates the idea that Stresemann, this new leader, who you'll be meeting shortly, in the way that we teach it in our school, he takes over from Ebert, and he's basically makes agreements with all the countries of Europe, which essentially says to the Nazis that they accept the Treaty of Versailles, which makes them really angry, and this is their protest, if you like. All right, so Stresemann starts paying the French reparations back. They then leave the Ruhr, and then Hitler thinks if Ludendorff can join the putsch. So Ludendorff is a really popular army general, loved by the people generally, with most people in the country, a war hero. If he can join this putsch, then it will give it some legitimacy, and it will hopefully bring more support to the Munich Putsch to try and take over Munich. Now, just for the geography of the thing, Munich is in the state of Bavaria. So Bavaria is in southern Germany. It's its own sort of state, a bit like, in our country we've got Norfolk and things like that. So it's a city within the state of Bavaria, and Hitler's not very known outside of that. He's pretty much known now in Munich, a couple of pubs around Munich, but outside of the country, outside of Munich, sorry, he's not particularly well known. So that's where you might start thinking about the long-term successes of the Munich Putsch, and those of you that are watching this as revision, you'll be able to figure that out straight away already. All right, so in Bavaria they have a prime minister, and his name is Kahr. He hates the Nazis, but he also hates the government, the Weimar Republic. He believes, as all nationalists do, in strong leadership, probably to bring the Kaiser back, if anything. But he's just not quite as extreme as the Nazis. And what's happened is Kahr has essentially got all the right-wing parties to meet in November, and they didn't invite the Nazis. So the Nazis weren't there, but all the other right-wing parties were, and I think Kahr wanted to bring them together in order to sort of push out the Nazis and say they're a little bit too extreme, even for us. Hitler finds out about this meeting, and obviously that's where he invades the pub. And if he can somehow get Kahr and support, they would go from Munich up to Berlin, take over Berlin, and that would be the revolution. Now, in context, remember, we've already had loads of these political putsches. We've had the Kapp Putsch already, which was dealt with very simply, very easily, or maybe a little bit of luck, perhaps, in the Berliners following through with Ebert's strike. We've had the communist uprising, the Spartacus. So these things are normal. This is just another putsch in a very unstable Germany. But Hitler believes that this is the one that's going to be the time. Now is the time, thanks to the chaos of 1923, hyperinflation, all of those horrible things that have affected their lives. So overall, that's the summary. So in your notes, you've got 3 key people here that we could be adding to our key people notes. We haven't particularly got any facts yet, but we'll see them in the next bit of the story. But here's the 3 people that we're thinking about. Obviously Hitler, Ludendorff and Kahr, and Stresemann we don't know about yet if you're watching this because you missed the lesson. If you are watching it for revision, then you obviously know who Stresemann is already. So if we go on to the 8th of November, this is where we're talking about this meeting. So there's all these right-wing political businessmen in a beer hall, in a pub in Munich. Hitler arrives with 600 armed Nazi SA brown shirts, stormtroopers. So there's your first fact that you can put into your notes. 600 Nazis burst into this pub. He threatens Kahr with a gun, and then Kahr obviously promises to support Hitler. Hitler makes this speech where he said that he had the support of the famous General Ludendorff. The crowd in the pub, who were, by the way, held in for hours with SA surrounding the building, so no one could get out. But of course, don't forget, everyone in the pub is right-wing anyway. So some of them probably did quite like what Hitler was doing. Some of them might not have been quite as right-wing or quite as extreme, but overall, when someone's holding a gun at your head, generally you do what they say. So everybody walks out of this thing on the 8th. Everyone's happy. The putsch has essentially been successful so far in taking this pub in Munich. They now need to take Munich, don't they? And then the first real problem here is, at this point on the 8th of November, they let Kahr go. So Kahr leaves. And of course, he's going to go and tell the authorities because he only agreed to the putsch with a gun at his head. So the 9th of November, the next day, Kahr, obviously, as we've said, doesn't like Hitler, doesn't trust him. So he tells the army, who are still loyal to the government, even though there are only 100,000 of them, he tells them the plans. On the 9th of November, then 3,000 Nazis, including Hitler, Ludendorff, Goering, Röhm, Streicher, all these important Nazis, they sort of march through the streets of Munich, hoping to get more support as they go. They believe they're going to get support because everyone is really angry and fed up of the last year. And as they march through the streets, the support just doesn't come, really. Partly maybe I think because people are fed up of the chaos and the violence. People are just ready for a bit of stability, probably. So they don't come. But 3,000 Nazis is quite a significant amount of people walking through the streets anyway. But when you think about the Spartacus uprising with 100,000 communists in the streets, this one is really quite a small little gathering. So on the way as they go, a little bit of backstory. They rob a couple of banks owned by Jews to just get some funds. The police and the army, of course, who've been tipped off by a car, are waiting and they ambush them. Partly a disappointment, partly a bit of a shock. Hitler wasn't expecting that. And as we've said, he did expect a lot more support, really, that didn't come. So the rebellion has been crushed within minutes. 16 Nazis have been killed, 3 police officers. There's a couple of other facts in your notes. Hitler escapes, I think, finds himself hiding in a bit of a closet, really, and is discovered a couple of days later in this wardrobe, and he's arrested and he goes to prison. So that is essentially the story. With all that said, and what I've been talking about, and then what you can read, fill in as much of your note sheet if you can, or however you're doing your notes. Make sure you understand the story. That's the most important bit, really. And then we'll move on to start thinking about the consequences of the Munich Putsch. At this point, it might be quite interesting for you to sort of decide, was it a disaster? I believe it was a disaster. It was an embarrassment, a humiliation. It was over in minutes. But there may be some little seeds of promise that come out of this. So when we think about then this story, look at source B. Always useful to look at sources, just practicing with the sources, really. This was an announcement on the 9th of November by Kahr, the leader of the state government of Bavaria. He says the deception and treachery of ambitious rebels, Hitler, the Nazis, have changed a peaceful meeting held to encourage people to work together. So he's trying to set this scene that he was just trying to bring some stability to Germany or to Munich, and Hitler's bounced in and ruined it all. This disgusting scene of violence, the declarations of support forced from myself, from General von Lossow and Colonel Seisser at the point of gun, they're null and void. Basically what he's saying is, I only agreed to it because they had a gun at my head. Please don't, punish me, I guess is what he's saying. The troops are gathered to support them. They're all been banned. The Nazi Party has now been banned. So another example of how this was a complete and utter failure. They attempted to take over Munich, and all they've ended up is being arrested and being banned. So that's Kahr's sort of way of maybe weaseling out of this. But to be fair, he was coerced into joining it with a gun at his head. Okay? So this image, another source to look at. And of course, remember, there are going to be sources in the Germany paper, either as an inference question for question 1 or during the section B. How useful are these sources? So it's always good to practice. Pause the video and have a little note down of things you see in this painting. Look at the provenance of the source. Try and figure out if it's positive or negative to the Nazis. It should be fairly straightforward. And then unpause the video and we'll see if we can have a little look ourselves. All right, welcome back. So firstly, we can see in this painting that it's the army have met the 3,000 Nazis marching through the streets. The ambush is there. I feel like it's pretty positive in that Hitler is sort of standing right at the centre of the painting, hand up, looking defiant, looking strong, looking brave. We can see the dead Nazis at the front. We know there are 16 of those. And obviously we can see a general scene of defiance and positivity from the point of the Nazis. So if you look at the provenance, you can work that out. This painting was painted in 1940. One of Hitler's followers, this is during the Nazi years. Obviously, it's during World War II as well. He was there, the guy who painted it, Schmidt. Hitler standing at the front with the rebels and his arm is raised, Ludendorff to his right. This is obviously painted in 1940 to, I suppose, reinstill the vigour for support of the Nazi Party now that World War II started. Maybe people were starting to get a little bit fed up of the fascist authoritarian rule under the Nazis from 1933 to this point. So basically what they're doing is they're reminding people of the bravery of Hitler taking back Germany and making Germany great again, for want of a better term. It also may be just as a reminder that where it all started for the Nazis. So that is generally what we get from this source, which is quite a nice source. Very useful. I'd ideally like this to be a section B source in your exam. You could add all sorts of own knowledge to what's happened here, what you can see, the 16 Nazis, 3 police officers ambushed. All of that stuff could be your own knowledge, and it's very easy to pick out some content. Even the provenance is really good as well. All right. So we've had a little bit of source practice there, doing a little bit of cop, just by listening. So if you want to make sure you add some of that to your notes, if you didn't get that when you were doing this independently, feel free. Just always take the opportunity to practice sources. All right. The cop analysis at the very least. Right, so now we've got an interpretation of the event. Now, the whole thing, remember, I've said to you at the start of this lesson, Section B, it would be an absolute dream. Two interpretations. One, the Munich Putsch was successful. One, that it was a failure. So let's read through this one. Interpretation 2, it says, the state police rounded up hundreds of rebels, disarming them on the street. The rebels left behind at the beer hall to hold the command post was so unstrung, unsettled by the whole catastrophe, they surrendered without any resistance to the police. So those that were waiting, following instructions, they stacked up their arms and they went home to brood. They were angry, they were embarrassed, licking their wounds a little bit. The putsch was over, but victorious state police marching away from the beer hall were abused by indignant citizens. That means citizens who aren't willing to go down without a fight. They cry, betrayers of the fatherland, Jew defenders, bloodhounds, and Hail Hitler, down with Kahr. So although the Munich Putsch has clearly failed, there are still some support there, and the police have been abused. So overall, we can have a little practice of this Section B. Question 3B, what is the view of interpretation 2? You could have a go at that now. So remember the script that we talk about, the view of interpretation 2 about the consequences of the Munich Putsch are, in this case, this is obviously quite negative, that it was a complete failure. And then pick out a sentence that backs it up by saying, I can tell this because it says. All right, once you've had a go at that, let's carry on and let's look at this consequences of the Munich Putsch in a little bit more detail. So if you have the Rise of Evil, again, another excellent visual of the whole putsch is from 1 hour, 6 minutes and 50 seconds to about 1 hour, 14 and 30 seconds. Just to give you that visual again of what we've talked about, and it really will just consolidate the story so far. So why has it failed? It failed because it was badly planned. Maybe a little bit emotional in its plans. Maybe it was rushed because the Nazis felt this was the time, because everything that had happened in 1923. Either way, it was pretty badly planned. They did not surround the army barracks. That's part of the planning, isn't it? They didn't put any of the SA around the army that would have kept the army inside the barracks, not to get out and then, of course, meet and ambush them in the streets. So that's a really critical mistake, to be honest. Letting Kahr go was another huge mistake, because he's the one who then went on to inform the authorities. And, of course, they thought more people would join. That is the fundamental failure of this whole putsch, because I think if there was 100,000 Nazis marching through Bavaria, maybe the army would have felt not been quite so quick to deal with it. But the fact that there was only 3,000, I think that was a big overestimation or underestimation from Hitler in how much support he was going to get. The lack of support from Kahr. Obviously, you need the leader, the Prime Minister of Bavaria, to be fully supportive of this. And the very next day, when he gets out, he issues that statement we've just talked about, who didn't support it, which means it's just a extreme right-wing party having another go at trying to take over the country, like we've seen thousands of before since World War I ended. Communication was poor. The breakdown between the SA in the pub, out in the streets, and Hitler, it was just a complete disaster really on the night. So we've got a fair few stories to tell you on how it failed. You could be asked, the 12 marker, explain why the Munich Putsch failed. It's not quite so easy. I struggle a little bit getting 3 clear reasons or paragraphs for this, but you've obviously got planning, you've got lack of support, and maybe, I don't know, the communication bit, something like that. But you've just got to tell the story about why it failed. And of course, the ambush, the police were ready for them, weren't they? And they shot at the Nazis. So Hitler was then, I forgot to mention before when we were looking at it, he was pulled down in the scuffle when the army started shooting, and he dislocated his shoulder. I always think, and I always say this in class if you're watching this because you missed a lesson, how interesting, how different would the world have been had Hitler been maybe 20 or 30 centimetres either side and was maybe shot at this event in 1923. Who knows if there ever would have been World War II or the Holocaust or anything like that. Is this one of those little things to think about as a historian, not just here to pass exams, but as a historian, how history is on a knife edge sometimes, and the future can be so brittle depending on one event somewhere. So that's always an interesting way to look at this. Especially if you look at the painting and the Rise of Evil, you can sort of see the scene of one. we're talking about. So now let's look at the consequence of the Munich Putsch, the most important bit of this story, particularly if we're looking at this through the eyes of Section B. One interpretation saying the Munich Putsch was successful, one interpretation saying the Munich Putsch was a complete and utter disaster. So short-term consequences of the Putsch: Hitler and the other leaders have been put on trial. They've been arrested. Hitler was obviously found in a wardrobe, as we've said, with his dislocated shoulder that he got pulled down at the end of the Putsch during the ambush. So very easily, the Nazis have been rounded up. It helps, doesn't it, when Carr is the one who's sort of pointing them out now that he's changed sides. The NSDAP have been utterly humiliated by this whole event because it was over so quickly. You know, we've talked about the reasons why it was over so quickly, but it was. So maybe they've got a little bit of a humble pie to eat here. Ludendorff was found not guilty, which sort of makes a bit of a sham of the whole thing, because clearly Ludendorff was involved and did support it. But he was found not guilty, probably because he's a national hero, and the judge probably quite liked him, which we'll maybe see a little bit of a link to that in a minute. Hitler was, in fact, in the end, found guilty of treason and sentenced to 5 years, which is amazing considering he's committed treason. But 5 years in prison. The party has been banned from 1927, and Hitler was unable to speak until 1927. Now, obviously, he's in prison. He's not going to be doing much speaking, is he, for 5 years? I think he's got a very lenient sentence there, and we'll talk about that in a minute because there's a reason for that. So that is the short-term consequences. Overall, a complete disaster. What you're looking at on the screen now would be your own knowledge for the source question, or own knowledge for the 20 marker, the interpretations essay. You're just going to talk about what you know here, what happened as a result in support of an interpretation that says the Munich Putsch was a complete and utter disaster, which on the surface it was. All right, so that is quite straightforward, nice and easy. Now we get a little bit more interesting and people start twisting the story a little bit into some sort of success. All right, so the long-term consequences of the Munich Putsch are that Hitler uses his trial to become internationally famous, definitely all around Germany and for sure around Europe and maybe parts of the world. They now know who this guy is. He was just a guy angry down in Munich, getting a few people coming to his meetings and his crowds, but that was it. That's where it stayed in Munich. Now he's getting notoriety. He's becoming famous because at the trial, the judge lets him rant. He lets him do what he does best, which is speak. His performance is obviously polished. And every day at the court case, when even though Hitler's the one on trial, the judge, who is right-wing and definitely supports the Nazis' views, allows Hitler to go on day after day after day about the Treaty of Versailles, about Dolchstoss, the November criminals. And of course, there are journalists in the crowd watching this court case, and they're writing everything. So more and more people start flocking to buy the newspaper the next day to find out what this Hitler said the next day in the court. And he becomes really famous. So for sure, a success of the Munich Putsch for the Nazis, even though he's in prison, is that he's now famous, which is going to help later on. Okay, Hitler realized that taking power would never work. He knows he can't take power by force. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for anyone really over the last 3 or 4 years of the early Weimar Republic. But he's now realized that he needs to get elected properly. And there's a term that we'll use and we'll say ballot, not bullet. That's the sort of way, just to remind you a little bit about the Nazis' new policy. So when Hitler gets out of prison, he's going to rebrand the party. This will be a later lesson. If you are watching this for revision, then you should know that already. They rebranded the party. They made it a bit more mainstream, a bit more of a real party, not just a gang of thugs going around the streets murdering people. And they made it all look a bit more polished, ready for when they got an opportunity. Now, so in that sense, you can see again some sort of success of the Munich Putsch. Long term, a real important realization. Now, I often have this argument with my students in my classes, who say that the Munich Putsch was a reason Hitler got elected in 1933. I don't believe that it is. Apart from the fact it's making Hitler famous, and obviously that does play a part later on in 1933, in the election of 1924, the year after the Munich Putsch, the Nazis didn't do particularly well. Even though the party was banned, they just changed the name and ran under a different name, but they were essentially the same party. And then in 1928, in the next general election, they only got 12 seats. So my argument is, if the Munich Putsch was that successful in getting Hitler elected, why did they only get 12 seats in 1928? So that's my argument. And the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression of 1929 to 33 is the reason why I believe Hitler was elected in 1933. But of course, I have to concede that if he wasn't as famous as he was then by 1929, he wouldn't have got elected probably. So in that sense, there's a real long-term success. But I don't believe the Munich Putsch was a direct influence in him getting elected. That's just my argument. And I quite enjoy having this debate with the students as well. What do you think? So as we carry on then, we look at source G, and this is what Hitler himself wrote. So we're looking at provenance. It's a letter written by Hitler in 1924. There's all sorts of positives you can say there, why that's useful. It's Hitler himself. It's a letter, a private letter, so he's not going to want to be lying in this. He's writing to his leadership team, isn't he? So this is what he's now saying. When I resume active work, in other words, when he gets out of prison, it will be necessary to pursue a new policy. Instead of working to achieve power by an armed coup, a takeover, we will have to hold our noses and enter the Reichstag. In other words, he's going to hate it, it's going to stink, but they're going to do it. They're going to go into the government, the parliament, and they're going to do it properly. If outvoting them takes longer than outshooting them, at least the result will be guaranteed by their own constitution. What he's saying here is that we're going to try and manipulate the constitution, the country that they created, and we're going to do it legally, whether they like it or not, but we might have to be really patient for that. Arguably, like I've just said, it didn't work, did it? This new regime, because the results in 1928 were so bad. So they're going to wait for an event that might help them to sort of sneak in or fly in and take advantage of this. So sooner or later we shall have a majority, and after that we shall have Germany. So this gives us a really good insight into how Hitler's feeling in prison during his 5-year term, what he's thinking, how he's feeling about going forward, and the lessons that he's learned. So that's the ballot, not bullet, that we're talking about there. So your own knowledge, if you saw a source like that, would be just tell that story. Also, significantly, whilst he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf, his book, My Struggle, which essentially is like a blueprint for what's coming. The plans, he gets everything in mind. Now, Mein Kampf is a bit of a weird book. It's a rant. It's page after page after page of ranting, syphilis, STDs, but also hatred of the Jews. There is no doubt to anyone who's read this book that Hitler was going to do something significant when it comes to Jewish people and foreign people, and obviously all the things to make Germany great again. Essentially, though, this book becomes the plan. The fact that he's been in prison and he's been allowed to sit back and write it, perhaps if he wasn't in prison, maybe he wouldn't have had the time or the inclination to write Mein Kampf and to put everything out on the table and plan it all really carefully. So that's what Mein Kampf is. It's his plans, it's his future ideas. All right. So that is another important consequence and a sort of long-term success. And then, joke, the Nazi Party ban is lifted in February 1925, so it didn't even last to 1927, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But also significantly to note at this point is Hitler only served 9 months of his 5-year sentence. Again, a complete joke. He's committed treason, but that is what happened. He was given parole by a very lenient right-wing judge. So there we go then. We could just take a little bit of a pause right now before we sort of bring an end to the Munich Putsch story, and you've got plenty of information to now start trying to get around your head whether you think the Munich Putsch was a success or a failure. What interpretations are you most likely going to be leaning towards? Long-term success, definitely no short-term success, an absolute short-term failure. That's what I'm going to try and push onto you, but of course you are a historian, you're able to make up your own mind. So when we feel like we've got a place to go, we can carry on with the lesson and we'll have a little look at section B. I've got some interpretations and some sources to have a little practice with, just to end this lesson, just to get you thinking about what this will look like in your exam. But before we do that, let's have a little think about the court case. You can read this bit yourself. So pause the screen and read this bit yourself. In your notes, can you answer that question? How did Hitler use the trial to his advantage? Just read through it. What positives came out of the trial for Hitler? There's a few really obvious things that you want to be doing in there. The fact that the judge had already presided over one of Hitler's cases he's a right wing and he absolutely let Hitler do the rant. The things he's ranting about, they obviously trigger the things that people in Germany are angry about, the treaty, Dolchstoss. So by giving this platform, it's not only made them famous, but it's also triggered, galvanized, gathered loads of support, not just in Munich, but internationally, throughout all of Germany, all those angry people. So just take the time to pause the video, read this carefully. This is information from the trial, and just make a few notes about how he used it to his advantage and turn this trial for treason into an absolute success. What a platform he was given. All right. So to finish off with that Rise of Evil, 1 hour 18 is the court case. Again, the visual of that is outstanding in this film. It leaves you in no doubt about how Hitler used the court case, what he ranted about. So again, if you've got access to Rise of Evil, it'd be really worth now having a little watch of that before we have a little look at Section B. Now, for revision, if you're watching this as Year 11, for a revision exercise, as always in history, especially where there's a story involved, a nice bit of revision is a storyboard. Okay, so your captions and some images. Remember, we're turning words into pictures and a bit of dual coding sometimes. All overlaps in this learning science, how we get things into our long-term memory. So perhaps the notes you've made in your note sheet, turn that into a little storyboard now, however you want to present it. This is on our website in the Germany section if you want to download a blank one, or just ask your teacher for one in our school. So that's a lovely way to sort of summarize the story. And here again, it's just another way of revising and thinking about where we could put success and failure in these scales. You put what you think, pause the video to spend as long as you need to on this. Particularly, this is more of a useful exercise if you are Year 11 revising before your exams. If you're watching this because you missed a lesson, still have a go at this bit, but definitely keep in mind this for later on. Overall, where do you think the Munich Putsch falls? So let's now end the story. That's the end of the Munich Putsch. Hopefully that was straightforward, sort of half an hour lesson. A really easy story, I think, but a really important one, and one that I really believe at some point has to be a Section B on our exam because it just lends itself so well. So remember the two interpretations. Interpretations in Section B could be good, bad, success, failure, improve, didn't improve, liked it, didn't like it, all things. It's not always success or failure. In this case, it would lend itself perfectly to two interpretations arguing success or failure. So Section B is the biggest part of your paper. You've got about an hour and 5 minutes really to spend on this because you've got to do a little bit of reading. The first Section A is the inference 4 marker and the 12 marker. So Section B is where all your money is in this paper, and luckily it's quite a scripty part. All right, so the first question in Section B, 3A, is our COP question. How useful are two sources for an inquiry into something? Now remember, it's exactly the same as the trenches paper. The more we practice these sources, the more you're confident in. A quick COP analysis means that you get a quite easy, straightforward answer to it. So please, please, please don't rush this bit, all right? You haven't got loads of time, but you've got a little bit of time. So pause the video and do a quick COP analysis. Underline something maybe in the source that the quote or the content that you think you know something about, because then you would back that up with your O knowledge in the answer that you would write. In this case, the focus of the question is an inquiry into the consequences of the Munich Putsch. So always, as always, we always say this, make sure that you are focusing on the question that it's asking, not your own question. Make sure everything you say relates back to those words. So the whole of Section B, you now know from this very first question, is going to be about the consequences of the Munich Putsch. Every question will relate to the consequences of the Munich Putsch, the whole thing. This is why Section B could be the Hitler Youth. It could be how did Hitler become the dictator? So 1933-34 year. It could be how did he control Germany, propaganda or terror. Always there will be two elements, but the whole of Section B is going to be on the same topic, which is really good if we get a nice one. If we get one like this, we should hopefully be laughing all the way to the marks bank. So pause the video, do your COP analysis. Remember, provenance is the writing at the top of every source. That gives you an idea about what the source is, who made the source, when, and maybe a why. All of those things are going to help you get some marks. And if you see your answer sort of, it's not quite strictly speaking 2-4 markers, but you've got two paragraphs, haven't you? You've got source B and source C separate. You do not need to compare them at this point. You do not need to say one is more useful than the other. Just why are these sources useful? unpause, come back, we'll have a quick talk, and then we'll move on to the interpretations. All right, welcome back. So hopefully you've picked out some provenance. Let's do the provenance first of source B. Straight away, it's a letter. Again, really important, this letter. Going to be a private letter, isn't it? Written to the leadership of the Nazi Party from Ernst Röhm. Now, you straight away should be thinking to yourself, this is brilliant. I'm going to get my provenance marks so easily because Ernst Röhm says he's the leader of the SA. He's literally the one who would know. He's been involved in the planning. He's really high up in the Nazi Party, and he's writing this letter to the leadership explaining what he thinks has happened. And it's happened literally the day after. So all of that in itself. Now, remember, the provenance is a tricky one. You really just need to get by with one point about the provenance and why that makes it useful. But in this case, you could have a bit of a field day and maybe write more than you need, but you'll certainly guarantee if you just say how those features of the provenance make it useful. Just don't say it's a letter by Ernst Röhm because you'll get no marks for that. But provenance in source B is really, really, really easy in this case. It's not so easy in source C. But let's do source B first. You might have picked up the first sentence. The state police round up hundreds of us, disarming us on the street. This is Röhm explaining to the Nazis what happened when they were ambushed. So I would straight away think, there's your C, there's your content. So you'll say, source B is useful for an inquiry into the consequences of the Munich Putsch. As it says, quote, the state police rounded up hundreds of us, blah, blah, blah. You then can add your O to that, your O knowledge, and that should be really straightforward, especially if you're doing it right now, having just done the lesson. You give the story the ambush and car being let go and 16 dead Nazis, and all of that stuff will really make your answer very clear as to why this source is so useful, because it gives us this insight into what's happened through the eyes of Röhm, who's there in the street as it's happening there, and then right in the day after. You can pick any one sentence. Maybe we only need to cop once. Make sure you don't spend too long on this because we haven't got a long time for this source question. Maybe 14 minutes max, and that's for both paragraphs. So hopefully you can see just from listening to what I'm saying, and maybe you want to annotate yourself what I've said. Source B is an excellent source for how useful. Now, source C is also a good source, but the provenance is a little bit trickier. So this is an extract from The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. He's a journalist who's written this book. Now, he was living in Germany in the 1930s, and where this gets a little bit tricky is obviously the Munich Putsch was 7 years earlier in 1923. But he's essentially talking about that the Munich Putschers helped the Nazis get into power. And that is where the idea of ballot not bullet comes in, and maybe some of the long-term successes that we've mentioned in this lesson. So your own knowledge, really, when you pick out one of those sentences, maybe even the first sentence again, Hitler was shrewd enough to see that his trial would provide a new platform for which he could, for the first time, make himself known. You back that up with your own knowledge about how he used the trial, what he ranted about, how he became famous. Journalists wrote every word he said, the judge, blah, 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 blah. So again, C and O is really, really easy for this. The provenance, though, as I say, is a bit tricky. He publishes this book back in the USA in the 1960s. Obviously, there's no Nazi party, so he's not afraid to say anything. But to be fair, he's in America. So even if it was in America in the 1930s, he could say what he wanted, really. But the fact is, he's saying after the time, it's obviously quite a positive slant on the thing, really. You can see, hopefully, where provenance is a little bit tricky on this one. But basically, he is recounting his experiences. He is saying that, yes, the Nazis changed their tack and they got elected in 1933. I was living there at the time. They used this event to their advantage. That is kind of what he's saying there. So, okay, we've got our cop there. Hopefully, if you did that independently yourself, you managed to pick out some of that yourself. But about 14 minutes or so for that. Still quite scripty, isn't it? Although don't rely on a script for the source question. Be more natural in your answers. Don't just look at it as C-O-P. Just make sure that you use those things to remind you of what it is that you're picking out. And remember to say how useful. Both of these sources, I would say, are at least very useful. I think the first one is extremely useful, personally. All right, so that's 3A and then 3B. Now we start getting to grips with the interpretations. And the challenge for section B is your ability to read, because you sort of have to work some stuff out, work out what people are trying to say. And sometimes it's easier than others. In a case like today, this section, these two interpretations, they're really quite obvious what we're talking about. Now, interestingly, because you've just done the sources, that's already going to start helping you as we go through section B. Now, just maybe I should have said while the sources were on the screen, you can identify those two sources, which side they're on, support for being a success or being a failure. So just be thinking about, while you're doing your normal source question, think to yourself, right, I know what's coming now. I know the interpretations are going to be something similar to these sources in their views. Get your head into that frame of mind when you start section B, and you'll see that that plays out as you go forward. So the first thing perhaps to do before we break down these interpretations and have a little practice is match up these two interpretations to one of the sources we've just talked about. So you might need to scrub back on the video a little bit, but which source does interpretation 1 match up to, and which source does interpretation 2 match up to? You'll see why that's important in a minute for question 3C, but if we are starting to mentally do that before we even get on to 3C, half our job is done, and that's going to save us some valuable time in this exam paper. All right. So hopefully you've done that, and we'll see if you were right in a minute. So the two interpretations about the consequences of the Munich Putsch are quite clear. Interpretation 1 says Carr was forced to promise support, but this was short-lived, blah, 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 blah. What I'm suggesting there is, what I'm feeling like I'm reading is that interpretation 1 is going to be the negative one, the one support and failure. It gives us some information in there, doesn't it? The 16 Nazis, Hitler's being driven away, all this kind of stuff. So that automatically means that interpretation 2 is going to be the opposite of that, which is going to be more positive to the Munich Putsch. And you can read that it starts off, on the surface it seemed a failure, but actually it was a brilliant achievement for a political nobody. So we can see straight away, before we've even delved too deep into this. Now, with a bit of luck, we get a paper, a section B, that is as straightforward as this. It may not be, but essentially the task, what we're doing is the same. They could be asking us about bananas and apples, or pineapples and cars. As long as they're different, as long as you can work out what's going on. All right, so let's have a practice of actually answering the question. What is the difference in the views of interpretation 1 and 2 about the consequence of the Munich Putsch? Remember, that's our focus of the whole of section B. So now, using the script, pause the video and answer using our script, okay? So the view about, you start with the view of interpretation 1 about the consequences of the Munich Putsch is that it was a failure, and then your script will then continue, I can tell because it says. So pause the video. You answer that, pick out a sentence that supports that. Notice as well in our open line here, we've got the focus of the question, the words of the question in our answer. Unpause when you're ready, and we'll see if you picked out a similar thing to me. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you picked up something like this. I can tell this because it says, quote, the Nazi party was banned and Hitler was given the minimum sentence of 5 years. Now that to me is quite obvious that it was a failure. You've gone to prison. The party's banned. So then we want to flip it round, because the question is asking us what's the difference in the two views. We say whereas, or on the other hand, the view of interpretation 2 about the consequences of the Munich Putsch is that it was successful. So we know that. That's obvious. We know that's coming because we know our script. So now again, pause the video, go and find the sentence from interpretation 2 that supports it being successful. And then when you're ready, unpause, and let's see if you picked out a similar question or quote to me, or you picked out your own. Okay, so welcome back. My follow-up sentence is, I can tell this because it says, in a few hours, Hitler had catapulted the scarcely known unimportant movement into headlines throughout Germany and the world. That proves that it was successful. He's now famous. So there's 4 marks, and probably, folks, the easiest 4 marks in all of our history papers, probably. Maybe the 2 marker, the features questions in paper 2 and trenches, maybe they're quite straightforward. But as far as a script goes, as long as you remember to follow the script and pick out an appropriate quote and give your judgment, there's 4 marks, really, really easy. So that's 3B. So then we get on to 3C. I really like this question. It does catch people out a little bit, but it shouldn't. Now, this question is saying, why are those 2 interpretations different? Again, about the consequences of the Munich Putsch. The whole of section B is on the Munich Putsch. So please, please, please don't fall into the trap of just repeating what you've just said for 3B in saying what the differences are, success or failure. This is asking you, why are those historians, why have they came to different opinions about the consequences of the Munich Putsch? And again, gratefully, there is a script for this. So we start with our opening line. Interpretations 1 or 2 are different about the consequences of the Munich Putsch. Remember the words of the question, because they're based on different sources. That's our answer. There's our mark. That's the reason why. Now we need to do a little bit of jiggery-pokery with some of the quotes and some of the words of the sources and interpretations to prove to the examiner we know why they're similar. So as we asked you to do a minute ago, you've obviously hopefully now matched the interpretations to the sources. Just see if you can pause this video and come up with something they both say that's quite similar, and then I'll show you the script of how it could probably and should probably look. All right, so you've got to try and match something that interpretation 1 says that matches up to its source that supports that, and the other one as well. Okay, welcome back. So you might have said something like, interpretation 1 is based on sources like source B. Hopefully you match that up. That was quite obvious, I think. As it says, the Bavarian police had been sent to stop a few thousand supporters. That's what the interpretation says, which is similar to source B, which talks about the police response as well. Now, because we're being asked about interpretations, the quote must come from the interpretation, but you can paraphrase a little bit what the source says, as long as they are saying something similar. As you can see here, both of them are related to the police. So that's our sentence for that one. And then we'll go, obviously, whereas, because we're talking about the other ones as well. Interpretation 2 is based on sources like source C. As it says, it catapulted the movements into the headlines and around the world, which is similar to source C that talks about how Hitler used the trial to provide a platform and get his message out. So hopefully you can see that we've matched up, basically proving how they're both similar. And that is our 4 marks for this as well. A really straightforward script again, but you do need to do a little bit of work in this one in trying to wangle them together so they are similar. So you can see why that historian clearly read that and based his opinion on that source. Speaking of such, when we say in this answer, we're saying based on sources like source B, source C, whatever, because no historian would write a book looking at just one source. So we can't say interpretation 1 is based on source B, because they wouldn't do that. No historian would ever just look at one source and go, oh, I'll go and write a book now. So they'll look at sources like source B, lots of sources that maybe talk about the police response, and they come up to their formalized opinion after doing that. All right. So I'm hoping as you've watched this little bit of this video now, section B should not be anything that worries us greatly. Quite scripty. The source question is the same as the trenches. But then, of course, we do get to 3D, which is the essay, the 20 marker, which can obviously cause people a bit of stress because it's quite a large essay to write. However, I believe this is the easiest of all the big essays in all of our papers. And there's a fairly straightforward structure to it. Quite scripty again, but more of a structure to it, is you're being asked how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the success of the Munich Putsch? In other words, do you believe the Munich Putsch was a success? That's what this is asking. So it's a two-sided argument. You give your sentence, judgment, as always, and then you just have 2 big paragraphs, sort of not really arguing necessarily with each other at the point, but just separately. So paragraph 1 is going to be all about interpretation 2. Because that's the one in the question. You're going to be saying how interpretation 2 is correct, whether you agree or not. It's kind of irrelevant in this essay. You've got to be saying this historian thinks this, and actually, do you know what? Even though I don't agree, I can at least see why that looks like, okay, it definitely was success. So you're just basically doing that. You are supporting what the historian has said in interpretation 2. And then you're doing the same in paragraph 2 with the other interpretation. Interpretation 1, you're saying, again, this view is correct. They're both correct because they're both a historian's opinion about the Munich Putsch. Just because you disagree is not necessarily that important. You do need to answer that question, obviously, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 throughout? That comes in your judgment, definitely. You'll say, I agree to a larger extent with interpretation 2 about the success of the Munich Putsch. This is because, and give a little bit of a thesis statement, like we would do in any of our other introductions. Just give a little bit of a reasoning, not a whole essay in the intro, but just a bit of reasoning as to why you think you agree more with interpretation 2. And we'll talk about tone and stuff in a minute. That's going to get us some marks as well. So we are essentially seeing here, introduction, 2 paragraphs, how they're both correct, and then a conclusion where you sum up all together, why do you believe or agree with one of them more than the other? All right, so on the screen now, you can see essentially the knowledge that you will need for this question. Now, this is a massive, massive, important point. You've got to listen carefully. You are not being assessed wholly on knowledge for this question. You're being assessed on your use of the interpretations. So you have to make sure in your interpretations that you are using them in your answer. So really similar to the source question, but you are going to COCO, not COP. We don't need any provenance in this, but you need to make sure that within each paragraph, so in paragraph 1, we're talking about interpretation 2, remember, you need to have at least 2 quotes from that interpretation backed up with some own knowledge. Okay, that's a minimum. you need to have in this paragraph. Why is that interpretation correct? I know that this happened, this happened, this happened. So at least 2 quotes backed up with own knowledge, exactly the same as the C and O for the source question, just no provenance, okay? And you're going to be saying how this historian is using this information and it's valid and it's correct and all those things. That's how you're going to get your marks in this essay. All right, so you can see here there's some bullet points for each side. You've got plenty of own knowledge there that would hopefully back up the interpretations as well. And you've got the interpretations in this lesson. Just scrub back and forth if you need to remind yourselves of the interpretations. Remember, the whole of section B is working together. Essentially, each step, 3A, 3B, 3C, is leading towards this question now. So you already know what the views are from question 3B, so you can start your opening paragraph with the view of interpretation 2 is that the Munich Putsch was a success. This is true. This is valid. This is correct. And then you go on about how all the reasons why it was successful. But more importantly is you're using the interpretations. Don't just go on a big rant about how the Munich Putsch was successful, not putting your quotes in, because you won't get very many marks for that. This is not a essay-based argument. It's essentially arguing why one interpretation is better than the other. All right, so with Coco in mind, you've got to do that twice. If you can, within these paragraphs, if you can start thinking about some tone and language in there. Now, it says here you can do that in your conclusion, but it would be ultimately better if you can do that within the paragraphs. So if you think perhaps you've read those interpretations and some of the language is maybe a little bit over the top, a bit exaggerated, a little bit of hyperbole maybe dramatic, maybe personal, maybe you just think the language is too emotive, then you might say interpretation 2 to me is a little bit too emotive, too passionate, which gives it some limitations. Or you might say it doesn't include everything. It only focuses on one part, the trial maybe, and doesn't mention the arrest or the ambush. So you might think that affects it. So you need to then start thinking a little bit about what affects the limitations of the interpretation, both of them, but try and do that within the paragraph on each one. So you want to be trying to find some positives and some negatives of the interpretation within it, but definitely tone and language. Think about your English exams for that. Is the language used one-sided? Is it factual? Or is one of them not very factual, a little bit more vague? Again, the focus. Now, there's about 10 million possible ways you could critique the interpretations there, but definitely your tone and language is an easy one to sort of think about. So before we think about a conclusion, let's get our head straight on where we are with this section B. Now, it's the same no matter what the topic is. Remember, let's go back to the beginning. We need an introduction that says how far you agree with interpretation 2 about the success of the Munich Putsch, or the consequences in this case. Then you go straight into paragraph 1. Why is interpretation 2 correct? What's the view of interpretation 2? Just repeat that. You already know it from the previous question. And then say why that historian is correct. Backed up with the quotes and your own knowledge, at least Coco, at least 2. And then some tone and some language. How that improves, strengthens or weakens the interpretation. And then you say, on the other hand, the view in paragraph 2 of interpretation 1 is that the Munich Putsch was a failure and is also correct. Whether you agree or not, you have to say that historian is valid in their opinion. Coco, 2 quotes at least, backed up with some knowledge backing those quotes up. And then again, tone and language. Is it factual? Is it vague? Is it specific? I don't know, whatever you think when you read these things. And that's where this is a bit of a challenge for those of you that perhaps do struggle a little bit with reading. So there's your 2 paragraphs. That's essentially the essay in there. So I think that's quite straightforward compared to the perhaps paper 1 16 marker where you might have to do 3 paragraphs of comparison and why is one more important than another at one period. This is basically like they're both correct, both valid. This is why, and using the quotes, using the interpretations. You can also, if you're struggling a little bit for knowledge and you are panicking a little bit, remember you've read the sources. So the sources previously for question 3A, that'll have some information in there that might just trigger a little bit of knowledge for you that you can include in your answer. All right, don't say source A says or whatever. Just read it and think, oh, okay, I'm going to say that in my own words. And then our conclusion is you just summarize the main points you've said. Overall, why do you agree with interpretation 2 more than 1? Or vice versa? Was one of them just simply too over-exaggerated? Was one just more factual? And was one less vague? Maybe it covered lots of different things rather than just focusing on one thing. All right. Now, what you need to do, I'm going to give you examples now just to finish off this lesson, is to look at how we're using the quotes. Okay, so on the surface, the beer hall putsch seems to be a failure. We use that quote as part of our COCO. So for paragraph 1, we'll put that quote in. We'll say interpretation 2 says, and then the bit next to that is your argument, how you might try and write using your own knowledge how that's true. All right, so you bring in your story about the trial and what Hitler did and stuff. So that's your quote, and then you back it up. Hopefully you can see it's very similar to the source question. And then there's just examples for the rest of it. So we've got our 2 quotes and our 2 own knowledge back up there. Obviously you need to fluff it out a little bit more than that, but that is essentially what we need in this essay. Okay. I think it's important, although the list lesson only took 30 minutes or so, the second 30 minutes, a walkthrough of Section B, I think is a really helpful thing to do, particularly Year 11 if you are approaching your mocks and the real exam. Remember, the scripts generally stay the same, so whatever the topic is, we are almost one step ahead because we know what we need to do. We just need to make sure we manipulate our interpretations and sources into our script. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful for you, and you'll see lots of other more detailed feedback videos certainly for paper 3 and section B, but for all of our papers on our website in the GCSE section. So you want to be watching them, particularly for our mocks in our school, because we design our own mock papers based on what has not been examined in recent years, and that's always a bit of a risk because we just don't know what they're going to ask us. But I don't think there's any point really in doing a mock exam on last year's paper. So that's why you'll find them hopefully useful. There's a little library of those collecting as we go on the YouTube channel, but for nothing else, just for technique. If those of you that are worried about technique and how to do it, that's those videos are for you. And also in the Germany section, just where the arrow is pointing now, there's a little source sheet that you can click on. It's got loads of sources and interpretations with a sort of separate video similar to this one at the end of this one, but just going through the sources, practicing the COP analysis. So head over there and have a little look at that. And then that will bring us a close to this lesson. So once again, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you found the story easy, the consequences, and then the success and the failure, and hopefully section B, little walkthrough. And don't forget as well, an extra little source breakdown of lots of different sources just to get you thinking about how to cop these things. All right, so as always, thank you very much, and we will see you again for the next video. Goodbye, everybody.